Hello, this is Professor Cruz, and this is week 4 of World Cultural Geography. And this week we're going to talk about the demographic transition and population structure. Last week we answered the geographic question, where is the world's population distributed? The data that was collected for you to help you answer the question was collected by national governments in the form of censuses, birth certificates, death certificates, and other registration systems. While countries do not generally take a census each year, agencies estimate country and global population numbers and trends. Such agencies include the United Nations, the World Bank, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Population Reference Bureau, and others. These are primary and secondary data collection compilation entities that are credible. But remember, there are limitations to all collected data methods. Remember that as you continue to explore population data. We looked at the data in tables and maps last week. This week we're going to view population information through other types of graphics. This week we will analyze data to answer more specific questions such as why does population growth vary among regions? How do the age and sex structures of countries vary, and why does this matter? And what health threats do people in different countries face? Last week we learned that human population grew very slowly. This graph shows again the history of world population growth from millions of years ago to the present and then projects it to the future. Prior to the New Stone Age, humans were hunters and gatherers, moving from place to place in search of food and usually not settling in an area for more than a year or so. Eventually, people began to settle in locations around the world as farmers, and this is in the New Stone Age. As people had more reliable food sources, the population began slowly to grow as large families were needed to work the land. But life was still precarious as famine and disease kept deaths high. The bubonic plague, which you see on the graph, which is around 1300, the bubonic plague drastically reduced population in Europe, Asia, and Africa. In some areas, it is estimated that 50% of the population perished due to the bubonic plague. The Industrial Revolution, whose origin was England, sped up the population growth in Europe. While taking until 1800 to reach 1 billion, each additional billion has been added to the world's population in a shorter and shorter time. While we have been adding the 6th and 7th billion in 12-year increments, the United Nations projects the world population to peak at around 11 billion around 2100. And this is the question that you all addressed last week. The world population growth rate was highest in the 1960s at 2.1% per year and has declined to 1.2% today, so almost cut in half. Yet the size of the world population has continued to increase as we explored last week. This chart shows that almost all of the current and projected growth is slated for less developed countries, which are depicted in the gray color. The more developed countries are shown in black. And you can see that generally the population in more developed countries has stabilized, where the growth is happening in the less developed regions. These regions, and within the less developed regions, the most population growth is concentrated within the poorest regions of the countries. So to understand how population growth has grown so rapidly in such a short period of time, and the differences in the rates of growth among different countries, we now turn to the concept of the demographic transition is a model of population change that shows how high birth rates and death rates transition to low birth rates and death rates over time. It is divided into 4 stages. So remember, when we're looking at a population without considering migration, a population can only grow if births are higher than deaths. That is what we call natural increase. Stage 1 is a low growth stage where both birth rates and death rates are at a high level, resulting in low growth. So birth rates and death rates are high, so population is growing very slowly. For most of this period, people depended on hunting and gathering for food. When food was easily obtained, a region's population increased, but it declined when people were unable to locate enough animals or vegetations nearby. Life was very precarious in countries at this stage, and birth rates and death rates, particularly death rates, fluctuate greatly. There are very few countries, if any, in stage 1 of the demographic transition. Stage 2 is a period of high growth caused by rapid decline in death rates. Birth rates remain high, leading to a rapid population growth. The more developed countries entered stage 2 as part of the Industrial Revolution. Many less developed countries entered stage 2 later as a result of the diffusion of medical technologies and public health interventions introduced to less developed countries. So in stage 2, death rates decline, but birth rates stay high, and so the decline in death rates leads to high rates of natural increase. And this has typically happened in developed countries in the 1800s with introduction of sanitation um, measures and food becoming more dependable. In stage 3, we have the birth rate finally beginning to decline and the death rate declining and reaching equilibrium. Birth rates decline because people have fewer children as they recognize that because of declining mortality, their children are likely to live till adulthood. And then stage 4 is marked by both low death rates and birth rates, leading to zero or very low rates of natural increase. So this is a low growth period. And this condition is called zero population growth. Stage 4 is similar to stage 1 because they're both low growth periods, but life is very different for people in stage 4 versus stage 1. Instead of high birth rates and death rates, both are low. Life expectancies are much longer in stage 4 regions, and people die of different types of death, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Many experts believe that there are no countries in stage 1 of the demographic transition. However, demographers from the Population Reference Bureau suggest that Afghanistan, Uganda, and Zambia are still in stage 1 because they have fluctuating death rates. You can look at your population data sheets to check the birth and death rates for Afghanistan, Uganda, and Zambia. These nations all have total fertility levels at 5 or higher. Ghana, Guatemala, and Iraq are in stage 2 of the demographic transition. They have somewhat lower birth rates than the first 3 nations, but they have significantly lower death rates, and their death rates are declining. Even so, because their birth rates are significantly higher than their death rates, their populations will continue to grow for many decades. Countries in stage 3 of the demographic transition, and these are countries where the birth rates are declining and the total fertility rates are approaching replacement level, which is 2.1. And those countries are India, Gabon, and Malaysia. And then finally, we see examples of countries in stage 4 of the demographic transition, which are low or very low birth rates and very low death rates. And these countries have very low or, in some cases, negative population growth. These are Brazil, Germany, and Japan. If you review the birth and death rates for these nations on the World Population Data Sheet, you will see that for Germany and Japan, the death rate is higher than the birth rate. The total fertility rates are also below 2.1 children per woman, which is replacement level fertility. And that means basically that a woman is replacing herself and her partner. If you stay at replacement level fertility rate for several generations, your population will begin to stabilize and it will stop growing. Germany and Japan are currently at negative growth because their death rates are higher than their birth rates. And we will talk about this more in the next segment when we talk about the age and sex structure of countries' populations. Your text indicates that these countries, Germany and Japan, have passed through all the stages of the demographic transition and may currently be in stage 5, which would be decline. You can read more about the potential for stage 5 in your text. While birth rates in developed countries declined slowly over 200 years, birth rates in developing countries have declined rapidly over the past 50 or 60 years. One challenge to slowing births is the cultural history of early marriage and limited education for girls. This graph shows the declining numbers of young women marrying early. So it shows the percent of young women married by age 15 and also by age 18. For each of the selected countries, there are two bars. The first is a 1990s date, and the second is a more recent date. The darker blue portion of each bar shows the percent of young women married by age 15, and then the lighter blue portion shows the percent married by age 18. And for all countries except Ethiopia, the percentage of married by age 15 has dropped significantly during the time periods shown. While most women in Niger and Bangladesh still marry early, fewer are marrying by age 15. Early marriage reduces the opportunities for adolescent girls and leaves them vulnerable to early pregnancy and childbearing and prematurely ends their schooling. Part of the overall decline reflects improvement in girls' access to education. As girls' educational attainment improves, the proportion marrying early tends to fall. The total fertility rates correspond. The total fertility rate in Niger is still 7.6. It is 4.1 in Ethiopia and 2.5 in Peru. Again, you can check those figures on your world population data sheets. Another method to reduce births is to increase access to modern methods of contraception. The indicator measures the proportion of women who want to delay or limit childbearing and who are using modern methods of contraception. Over the past 2 decades, a significant number of less developed countries have seen increases in the share of demand satisfied with modern methods. Again, as you compare the high rates of modern contraceptive use, these also correlate to total fertility. The percent of family planning demand met by modern contraceptive methods for Nigeria is shown from 1990 to 2014 with the green line, the dark green line. Usage increased from 13 to 31%. And the total fertility rate, again, which you can find on your data sheet, is 5.5. The increase in Pakistan is greater, growing from 21 to 47% in the same period. The corresponding total fertility rate is 3.8. And in the Philippines, which is the orange line, the use grew from 40 to 71%, and the total fertility rate is 3.9, but the total fertility rate has declined from about 6.0 in the late 1980s. So in the late 1980s until 2012 or so, based on the orange line shown on this rate, the total fertility rate in the Philippines has declined from 6.0 to 3.9 children per woman. Since 2000, China has had a lower birth rate than the United States. The core of the Chinese government's family planning program has been the one-child policy, which was adopted in 1980. Couples in China receive financial subsidies, such as a long maternity leave, better housing, and in rural areas, more land if they agreed to have just one child. The government prohibited marriages for men until they were age 22 and women until they were age 20. Rules have changed in the 21st century as China has moved toward a market-based economy and families are becoming wealthier. Last year, China relaxed the one-child policy, so this is 2015, China relaxed the one-child policy, allowing couples to have a second baby if the mother or father was an only child themselves. While it is early days in the new policy, many parents are declining to apply for a second baby due to fears of financial burden. Their families are opposed, and they grew up being an only child and they're not used to larger families. So this now requires a different kind of cultural change. We will now move on to discuss how changes in birth rates, death rates, and fertility have an impact on a nation's age and sex structure, and what this means for future growth, the workforce, and the ability to care for the changing population. This graph shows the age and sex structure for the United States. This type of graph is fondly called a population pyramid, and we'll learn why they have this name in a little while. This is a histogram, so it's a type of bar graph that shows the age and sex distribution of an area's population. For this pyramid, which shows the population of the United States in 2012, we have the males on the left side, and we're showing the percent males in blue, and the percent females on the right side in red. The bottom bar shows the percent of the population aged 0 to 4. So we see that just 3% of males and 3% of the females, so a total of just over 6% of the population is age group 0 to 4. And as you vertically move up the graph, each bar shows the next age group until you reach the population age 100 and over at the top. And you can see that this is a very small, it's not even showing any population age 100 and over because they don't make up even a percentage. This graph shows the population only at one point in time. We can't tell what happened to the population. We're only seeing the population at a static point. So at this point, President Obama and Professor Cruz were age 50 in 2012. So it shows the population of the United States, the distribution in 2012. This shows the population that is aging. It is shaped like a pillar, although there are still a smaller portion of people over age 65. That portion is growing. The people age 50 are about the same percentage of the people age 0 to 4. For the United States, this shows a population that of the baby boom generation, here represented in the bars from age 45 to 70. And the children of the baby boom generation, which would be called the baby boom echo, and those are represented in groups age 15 to 34. When you have a age-sex structure or a population pyramid, it helps you understand what the needs of a country might be. Where are the people in the greatest ages? This could give you an idea of the amount of schools that need to be built, the number of senior care facilities that might need to be built. What would be the needs of the population based on the age and sex structure? Now let's move on to look at the age distributions for some other countries. I just want to remind you that about the phases of the demographic transition. We're going to use some examples from the countries on this chart. Uganda was represented in stage 1 of the demographic transition. Here we see the age and sex structure of Uganda for 2010 and then projected for 2050 in the future. We see here why the graphs are called population pyramids. When a population has a young population, they have a lot of people that are under the age of 15, it is shaped like a pyramid. And historically, most countries were shaped like a pyramid, and that's why these graphs are called population pyramid. In Uganda, each woman averages 6 to 7 children, and deaths to children under the age 5 are decreasing due to high levels of immunization, better maternal care, and better use of health services for ill children. However, the death rates continue to fluctuate because there is still poor nutrition, a high maternal death ratio. The death ratio you can find on your population data sheet, and high levels of HIV/AIDS, which you can also find on your population data sheet. The age-sex structure shows that almost 50% of the population is below age 15. There are very few people over the age of 65, just 2%. And there are more males than females in the adult ages, indicating a low status of women. Generally, women live longer than men. In the United States, women live 5 years longer than men on average, but in Uganda, life expectancy rate is just 2 years more for women. And when you see this, it indicates a lower status of women. As most of the population is less than age 15, we know that the population will continue to grow because this group under age 15 is generally below the childbearing years. They still need to move through their childbearing years. And you see in 2050, in 2 generations, they will have moved through their childbearing years, but you see that in 2050, it still looks somewhat like a pyramid, even though it is still leveling out. Chances are that the population will still continue to grow in 2015 and beyond. And this is why the population is still projected to grow till 2100. Now we will examine the age and sex structure of Guatemala, a country that is in stage 2 of the demographic transition. So remember that stage 2 is declining birth rates and declining death rates, and this is a high rate of population growth. Guatemala's population structure illustrates that women have been having fewer children for several years, which explains why the base of the pyramid is shorter compared to the elongated base of Uganda's pyramid. So there's more children in the base of Uganda. So half of Uganda's population is 15 and younger. For Guatemala, half of the population is 19 and younger. So it's a slightly older population than Uganda. So Guatemala's population is 19 or younger, still relatively young, and it's the youngest in Latin America. Guatemala is one of the many countries in the second phase of the demographic transition. When a country's age and sex structure is even from top to bottom, the country is close to zero population growth. And you can see here that it's not yet even. Guatemala's population is likely to control for several generations, and it begins to even out as we approach 2050, but even still, it would still be growing in 2050 based on the current projections. And now we're going to move to a country in stage 4 of the demographic transition, so a country at low, very low growth rate. And we're going to look at Germany. And again, here we see Germany for 2009 and then for 2050. And one of the things you can see here is the large number of people over age 80. For a country to reach zero growth or low growth, the population has to have a more even distribution by age. And we see this in Germany. Germany's population represents the shape of a pillar. So to be at zero growth, you probably need to look somewhat like a pillar. In 2015, its birth rate is 8, its death rate is 11. So the country is a negative growth. 13% of the population is under age 15. So compare that to 50% of Uganda's population under 15. 21% is 65 and older, so we have an older population. You can see that the largest age groups in Germany's population are 40 to 49 in 2009. In Germany, the government has to offer financial incentives for people to have children because the birth rate is lower than the death rate, but it has not really worked. The age-sex structure is typical of European countries in the 4th phase of the demographic transition who are at equilibrium or zero growth. Many of these countries have policies to bring in workers from other countries because they don't have enough working age people to support the people in the dependent ages. So again, use the pyramids to think about what a population needs to survive. And because we talked earlier about China's one-child policy, I would like for you to see how the policy has affected China's age and sex structure. Now, in this case, the population is shown on the left is males again, the right is females, but instead of percentages, we have millions. And so what we can see here is the obvious difference in the number of younger people, 0 to 4 and 5 to 9, compared to previous generations. In 2010, 17% of the population was under age 15, and this was down from 23% in 2000. The share aged 65 and over are growing slowly from 7% in 2000 to 9% in 2010, but you see that the bulk of the population is in the working age group. Imagine the shape in 20 years as the population continues to change. Also, note the dominance of the males to females in the youngest age group. So we have 40 million males age 0 to 9 and 40 million 5 to 9, but we only have 34 to 35 million in each of these age groups of females. In the one child policy, one of the consequences is that there is a favoritism for male babies. Normally, there are about 105 boys born for every 100 girls, but in China, the sex ratio of boys to girls is 120 to 100. And this has caused a problem in China as males reach the marrying ages and find that there is a shortage of females in the marriageable ages. We will end this segment on population with a discussion of the epidemiologic transition, which roughly follows the demographic transition, but instead of changes in birth rate, it tracks changes in the leading causes of death. The term epidemiologic comes from epidemiology, which is the branch of medical science concerned with incidence, distribution, and control of diseases that are prevalent among a population at a specific time. Stage 1 is related to the low growth period of the demographic transition. At this stage, mortality is high and infectious and parasitic diseases were the principal causes of death. Life expectancy was low, probably 20 to 40 years. Accidents and attacks by humans and animals were also prevalent. History's most famous and violent stage 1 epidemic was the Black Plague, or called the bubonic plague, which was probably transmitted to humans by fleas from migrating infected rats. HIV and Ebola are examples of infectious diseases. Malaria is an example of a parasitic disease. Stage 2 is a period where deaths decline rapidly. During this phase, the deaths from pandemic diseases decline. A pandemic is a disease that occurs over a wide geographic area, such as the plague, and affects a very high proportion of the population. Improved sanitation, nutrition, and medicine during the Industrial Revolution increased the spread of infectious diseases. Even with improving conditions, the decline was not universal, as poor people who lived in crowded and less sanitary conditions were still more susceptible to disease, and that's still the case today. Life expectancy at birth increases from 30 to 50 years, and famous pandemics include the plague of the 14th century, the Spanish flu of the 1980, HIV/AIDS today, and cholera, which has experienced many instances, and the World Health Organization estimates that as many as 120,000 people die each year from cholera. Stage 3 is represented by degenerative and man-made diseases, where the crude death rate stabilizes. It is characterized by a decrease in deaths from infectious diseases and an increase in chronic diseases associated with aging. These include heart attacks and various forms of cancer, but life expectancy exceeds 50 years at birth. Stage 4 is a delayed degenerative diseases and emerging infections. The causes of death are the same as stage 3, but life expectancy is extended through medical advantages, and medical operations and healthier lifestyles increase people's life expectancy. So at this stage, the life expectancy would typically be over age 50, probably 60 to 70. We spent the last 2 weeks examining world population growth and change, but we are all population actors, and our combined population actions impact the cultural landscape. As you examine the total fertility rate, think about how many children you plan to have in your lifetime, or for some of you, how many you've had in your lifetime, and how this has contributed or will contribute to the prospects for future growth in the United States. Think about your fertility versus that of your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. What is your life expectancy compared to your ancestors of the late 1800s or early 1900s? And how will your likely cause of death compare? In 2000, 28% of District of Columbia residents died from heart disease, and 22% died from cancer. In 1900, the leading causes of death in the U.S. were tuberculosis, pneumonia, diarrhea, and diseases of the heart. As we move forward to next week, think about the third component of population growth at the country level, migration. So this week, we will consider how many children are you likely to have in your lifetime? What is your life expectancy based on your circumstances? And what is your likely cause of death? And next week, we will consider who is likely to migrate to another region in their country or to another country as we examine migration's impact on the cultural landscape. Enjoy your week.